My name's Dr. Noah Charney, and the title of the article is Cracking the Sitcom Code. As happens to so many of us, I was asked to write a sitcom for Croatian television. I'm an American expat living in Slovenia, and I know next to nothing about Croatian, besides the fact that it's Slovenia's southern neighbor, a fellow ex-Yugoslav republic, and that the language resembles Slovenian except with a lot more J's in it. I'm a writer of the books and articles, and I used to write a lot of plays, but I've never written for television. So I immediately said, sure, of course I can do that, before rushing off to Google how to write a sitcom. In addition to much Googling, I spent a good deal of time watching sitcoms. I was after tips on how they are constructed, and watched actively, looking to crack open their laugh-tracked, shiny exterior to get at the goofy mechanism within, to see how they function. What I found out surprised me and changed the way that I watch television. From The Simpsons to Seinfeld, from Everybody Loves Raymond to Everybody Hates Chris, from Taxi to Arrested Development to Parks and Recreation, there is a highly specific, minute-by-minute recipe used to write the vast majority of sitcoms out there. And once you know the formula, it makes it much easier to write them and much harder to watch them without seeing that formula. The Sitcom Code everywhere. Well, it's a good question. I started out just writing books, and that's my main work. I've published over a dozen books now, and I'm also a professor of art history, specializing in art crime. So those are sort of my day jobs. But I have a hyperactive imagination, and I'm very productive, which is lucky, I guess. And so the process of writing books was just much slower than I like to be. I have a literary agent, and he tries to basically sell a book a year for me, maybe a book every year and a half, and he thinks that's what the market will maintain. Because if you have too many books coming out, then there's a sense that you saturate the market and the media won't cover them. So I had to figure out something else to do with my hyperactive imagination and productivity. And articles were very satisfying because you get to write them, you finish them. The act of completion is satisfying to me. You know, a book takes a year to write. An article takes a couple of days. And then you get the satisfaction of having them come out very quickly. It's also a case where there will often be far more readers of any one article of mine than of my books. I have one novel, and all the other books are trade nonfiction. And I've had some bestsellers, but a best-selling nonfiction book is going to sell, 20 to 50,000 copies if you're lucky. Whereas these articles of mine, they can have in the millions of readers. And so I very much like the chance to explore different fields, to stretch my writerly muscles, and to get that satisfaction of exposure and reader feedback. So this article for The Atlantic is a deconstruction of how sitcoms function from a writer's perspective. And I came to this because I was literally asked if I could help a friend of mine who's a very famous Bosnian comedian and director to write a sitcom for Croatian television. And this sounds a little funny, but I'm an American. I live in Slovenia for more than 10 years. And I'm pretty much the only Anglophone writer of note in this region. So I get to do these sort of fun side projects. And I had never done this before, but I said, sure, I can do this. And we wound up writing 3 episodes, which sat with the Croatian television network for whatever reason. They were commissioned and paid for, but never greenlit. And then the same show was optioned for HBO Europe, with the setting and the main country where it would be based shifted from Croatia to Romania. And that's still in development, which means it may not go anywhere, or in theory it could, but that's actually a much bigger potential stage. So that was the situation. And then when I encounter things in life, I'm specialized in writing about art, but I get to do these other sidelines like this sitcom writing. And I'm a professor, so I'm used to researching things. And so I wanted to research and learn as much as I could. And when I Googled it, I realized there was relatively little written on it. Of course, there were a lot of Google hits. But the best thing I found was a blog post from a blogger called Wise Sloth, which is a 15-page, second by second in some cases, breakdown of the format of sitcoms. And so this was the point of departure for my own study. And what I learned about it was something that seemed easily to translate into an interesting article, whether you're a writer or just enjoy watching sitcoms. And that's that there's a template that is broken down by the minute or sometimes even less about what needs to happen in most sitcoms. And of course, you can break the rules, but most sitcoms follow them because it's a formula that works over and over again. And when you know that, the writing becomes far easier because you have a sense of what needs to happen across the 22 to 24 minutes of filming time. You're basically plugging in that episode, what's going to happen. And the conclusion of the answer to your question is that for me, I have this sense that I haven't really done something to completion if I haven't written about it. Some people have this if I don't post a photo of it on social media, it hasn't really happened. But I have the same compulsion with writing about it. And so to me, that's like an act of closure and demonstrating to myself that I fully understand the situation or the experience that I had, if I can write about it and ideally get it published. So that's where that came from. Sure. I think the best option is to use the template. And I bet that somewhere online the template literally exists where it has minute by minute and blank spaces you can fill in. Otherwise, if you read my article, and there's a link to this one that was really the most helpful for me, this blog called Wise Sloth, which literally has a 15-page breakdown of the format. And you create a template. And so what needs to happen in the first minute? So the teaser is minutes 1 through 3. So the teaser is sort of like a little glimpse of coming attractions, what's going to happen in the episode. Then minutes 3 to 8, there's some sort of trouble that takes place or some conflict that launches the action. And then the muddle is what we call minutes 8 through 13. It can't be resolved, the conflict, immediately, otherwise it would be too short. So there has to be some additional complication. And so I would use the template and plug in whatever you imagine. And I think the easiest way to start is to imagine that you've been asked to write an episode of a sitcom that you already know and love. That is easier exercise because then you're dealing with just the mechanics of what needs to happen in the writing. You're not inventing a world and characters, which is a separate and more complicated exercise. So I would have your student pick any sitcom that she enjoys and knows very well. Seinfeld, Simpsons, you name it. And imagine that she was commissioned to write an episode of it. And then ask her to write one and invent it using those same characters and situations and formula that are already in place in that sitcom. I think that's the easiest first step before you might invent your own world and characters. So to answer that question, I think we need to talk a little bit about how articles are accepted by editors of magazines. This is something that I find is under-taught. You can take creative writing courses, and they don't necessarily teach you the logistics of how to be a writer, how to earn money, how to pitch articles to editors, how to write book proposals, how to get an agent. These are things that I started to teach a number of years back. I taught a course in London as part of the Guardian Masterclass series called Writing for Publication. And I recently did an online version in February. And the idea is teaching people how I've learned how to compel an editor to say yes to your article pitch. So this is a bit of a roundabout answer to your question, Todd, but in fact, I begin writing articles by writing a pitch for the article. And the pitch, if any listeners are unfamiliar with it, is basically 1 to 2 paragraphs explaining what the article will be, but with no expectation that it's written yet. Because if you are practicing as a freelance journalist, then you don't want to actually write the article until an editor has said yes to it. And the reason is that editors will often ask for variations on the ideas that you propose to them. Or they might say, I don't want what you propose, but how about you write about this? So just to give you an example, I'm basically the go-to person for the Guardian newspaper travel section on Slovenia, because I'm the Anglophone writer who lives there. So what's happened is I've published maybe a dozen articles in the Guardian over the course of many years. But when I pitch to the travel editors, I cannot remember the last time they said yes to my pitch. But when I do, it sort of reminds them that I exist, and then they say, we don't want these, but how about you write about this? And this is a case in point why I don't recommend writing an article on spec unless it's an exercise or out of interest, but rather you write an article pitch that in a tight way explains what's interesting about the article and what the article will be if the editor wants you to write it for them. And so what I do is write the pitch for every article idea I have, and I come across them all the time. Part of it is because I'm a foreigner living in a country where, to me, everything is new and interesting and a little bit different. And so anything that is happening here is unlikely to have come to the attention of the Anglophone world. That's just because I happen to live in this slightly exotic country called Slovenia. But whatever your milieu or situation, if you find things that you think would be interesting to write about, my initial recommendation is you just write the pitch and then only write the article itself if someone wants to take it. Now, there's a trick for writing pitches that I like to recommend to students. They don't have to be like this, but one of the best ways is to have a real hook of an opening line. Maybe the first sentence or two only, but the best ones that really draw in a reader, whether it's the reader of the article itself or an editor who might be saying yes to you, is to start with a cinematic narrative description, as if you're describing a film that we're seeing. And it should include the main protagonist of the article. So articles are best situated if there's a person who is going to be the lens through which we learn about whatever the subject of the article is. So if we want to learn about, Slovenian food, it's easiest and most compelling if I pick a Slovenian chef and they are the protagonist of the article, the point of entry to talk about the idea. Because we humans are very human-to-human oriented. We like to have a dynamic with other people at the core. And so it's easier for us to be interested in a story about another person than it is something that's just theoretical, like a food type. So I always recommend that you start with a very specific recipe. And that is, I want a cinematic narrative of 1 to 2 sentences that shows a person who you name specifically in a specific time and specific place, engaged in a specific action that is relevant to the story at hand. So just to give an example from my own article, it's okay if that person is you. That's an approach called gonzo journalism that developed in the 1970s in the US and remains probably the most popular type of feature writing, where the author is the main character and we see them engaged in an action. So in this case, for this article for The Atlantic, I'm the protagonist, and what you see me doing, or imagine me doing, is that I am in Slovenia, but I'm writing a sitcom for Croatian television. And so that's the sort of action you see. But it could be something that is more action-packed. For an article I wrote for CNN, for example, about a real-life Indiana Jones type of archaeologist, I opened with a cinematic few sentences about him macheting his way through a Mexican jungle and suddenly discovering this giant stone monster that was at the entrance to a lost city. So that's the long answer to your very short question about what I recommend to start with. So in looking for topics for articles, there are 2 questions to ask. One is whether the topic has been written about at all. And the second is whether it's been written about for the publication for which you would like to write it. So those are separate questions. It's it's pretty tricky to find a topic that nobody's written about in this day and age, in the internet era. But it's not really important that no one has written about it. The only important thing is that it hasn't been written about in the publication that you'd like to write it for. So, for example, The Atlantic would be unlikely to want another article about analyzing sitcoms, because they already have one. But any other publication might be very happy to have basically the same topic, because they haven't written about it yet. So to answer the question, for me personally, I find stories in the world of art history and art crime, which are my specializations, and to be honest, it does help to specialize. If you're too much of a generalist, then you wind up sort of floating. Specializing in something and becoming the go-to person for whatever the specialization might be, even if it's something obscure, is a better strategy, especially when you're getting started. I also have become a specialist in the country I happen to live in, Slovenia, and that's random, but if you have any sort of milieu or background or expertise or geographic location that is a little bit exotic and it does not have a lot of representative authors, then that's what you should focus on. And so I'm combing the news and within my area of expertise, and then I'm finding stories in Slovenia that are unlikely to have been on the radar for Anglophone readers. So that's how I generally approach finding ideas. Sure, I think so. Something that maybe is self-evident for Anglophone writers, but is not necessarily for writers from other parts of the world. So in Slovenia, where I live, I just finished teaching a writing workshop with a Slovene writer friend. And one of the things that we said that is absolutely necessary for good Anglophone articles, and that Slovene and a lot of Central and Eastern European authors don't do, is a step outline. So a step outline is basically you plan out what you would like to say in the article, what your case studies are, if you have quotes, if you're introducing people, if you're showing some sort of event. All of that should be outlined before you actually start writing the article. Now, if you get really good at this, sometimes you don't need that step. You're sort of outlining in your head, but especially when you're starting or if you're not used to the format, then it's very important, because what this does is give you the superstructure, or we might say the skeleton, and then the writing is actually adding the muscles and skin to it. But if you just start piling on muscles and skin without a skeleton, then the danger is that the article feels like it's drifting. It doesn't feel like a really smooth clockwork mechanism that the best article should. So it doesn't have to be complicated, but you should make bullet points about the argument or points you would like to make in the article, and consider what maybe the most dramatic moment is, and open with that, because an opening hook that is a point of maximum drama or tension or asks a question that the article will answer once you've finished it. So it's kind of like an Agatha Christie mystery. There's a murder in the opening scene. In the last chapter, you know that Miss Marple or Hercule Poirot will explain who the murderer is, but that question in the opening, the promise is that it'll be answered at the end. And you can do this in an article format too. So I think that probably creating the step outline is the single most useful thing you can do to immediately produce better articles. Sure. When I have students, I point out an article to them that I think is probably the best constructed article I've ever read. I'm not going to say the best written, because I think that good article writing should be clear and engaging, but doesn't need anything literary or anything like writer with a capital W. It should be clear and engaging and well constructed. And the article in question is called "The Mark of a Masterpiece" by David Graham. It's a New Yorker feature article. You can Google the name and author and you'll find it. And it is so well constructed, and it has a really surprising twist in the middle of it, an almost usual suspect style twist where you're completely caught off guard in a really engaging way. And it's really masterful. So that's the one that I recommend to my own students, and I would recommend to any listeners who want to read, the best of feature article writing. Well, that's a great question. I do a freelance writing for all sorts of different publications, but I think that the breadth of reading is probably the most useful. So I would just give the shout out would be read as many different publications as possible. You can read my articles or someone else's, whatever subject interests you. But I think it's a good experience for people interested in writing articles to sample the styles of a lot of different publications. And one of the things that I've found is the need to adapt. So I have a different writing style if I'm writing for The Guardian or The Washington Post, or something like Esquire, which has a sort of ironic hipster tone to it that I enjoy, but you have to shift gears. So it really depends on the publication. And so my shout out is going to be read as wide a breadth of articles as you can to get a sense of different authorial voices, and then see where you think yours might fit best.